Thanks so much for coming. We appreciate that it is a beautiful Friday afternoon and that for many of you, this is the last thing between you and the weekend. So we realize that it's a big deal that people make it to these things on a Friday afternoon. Thanks so much. So unless you've been living in a cave, you've almost certainly heard a lot of chatter in the media and elsewhere about IT kinds of disruption. It's changing all kinds of industries, reshaping, turning industries upside down and shaking them all over the place in a way that almost mystifies and beggars belief. And it turns out that the electricity sector isn't not going to be affected by these macro level forces. There's no denying that the electricity sector is a little bit late to the party in some regards. Some of the changes you see green shoots of evolution and revolution happening, but there's still a lot of change in front of us. And broadly speaking, that is what we are here to talk about today. Before we do that, though, and get into high gear with that, I do want to take a second to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we're meeting today, the land on which QUT Gardens Point specifically is standing on. This has long been a place of learning and teaching, and we're very privileged and delighted to be able to continue that tradition today. A quick overview of where we're going to go over the next 35 or so minutes. First of all, we want to create a shared understanding of how does the electricity market work today at the moment? Because for most of us, let's face it, you flick that light switch on and it's like magic. There's fairies in the wall that just make the lights go on. And most of us don't really understand all the parts that kind of go into delivering that capability. So David in particular will be kind of bringing us all up to speed on what that system looks like. And then we're going to ask the question, how are digital technologies changing things? That turning upside down and shaking around process that I alluded to earlier. We want to see specifically how that's playing out here, leading to the next bullet, and that is, what can we glean from what we know right now? And looking for examples and inspiration from what we see happening in other industries that have moved a little further and a little faster along this journey, can we make any reasonable predictions about where we think the electricity market of the future is going to go? What will it look like? And then this last bullet, obviously we're cosmopolitan people, men of the world, and so we're bringing a little bit of French into the whole thing, déjà vu. And the reason we do that is because while much of what we're going to be talking about with the future of the electricity sector, much of that's going to sound kind of crazy and new and a little bit anxiety-inducing, if you kind of look at the broad sweep of the energy sector, specifically the electricity industry, if you look at the broad sweep, actually, in many ways, we're going back to the model that we would have had about 100 years or so ago. So it seems very dramatic and very exciting when you can look at only a few decades kind of time frame, but when you look at longer time frames, we're kind of going back in a lot of ways to what we used to do.
So let's establish some common context around what we're actually talking about and give ourselves some scale and scope. We've used the Queensland electricity industry because many people in the room are familiar with it, but it's not atypical for the configurations of most electrical supply chains around the world. Power generators are out of sight and out of mind. They're big, smelly, large, dangerous, and very much built along the principles of NIMBY, not in my backyard. Rob's recently introduced me to a alternative way.
NIMBY on steroids these days. NIMBY on steroids is now banana. Build absolutely nothing anywhere near anything. So we've upgraded.
I quite enjoyed that. Because of that scale, though, because we're trying to get the economy of scale through those generators, there's a need for transportation over vast distances, which gives rise to a high voltage transmission grid. Only very few customers are prepared to receive that energy at that voltage level and also quantity. So the majority of it goes down into the distributor, which is your Ergons and Energixes of the world, who move from supply points around areas of demand to your house, to your place of business, etc. And then also we've had deregulation, so we have electricity retailers who ultimately trade commodity over that infrastructure. So we have seen some change in these explicit areas. Rob's invented the revolutionometer, TM. Power generators are changing their generation mix. Australia, not necessarily on the vanguard of that. We've seen much more of that in Europe, etc., when we've moved to renewables. But places like South Australia are actually far more than Queensland. And you can kind of see why, because of the footprint of fossil fuels available for us cheaply and at very close distance. The transmission grid and the networks themselves aren't really yet to be disrupted. So there's an interesting story on how their roles are going to evolve over time. The retailers, by the deregulation and the competition that's starting to be introduced in there, are actually able to, starting to be evolved a little bit. Smart meters, again, not quite there in terms of penetration for the Australian market, but again, very much part of the US market. California, very high penetration. Ultimately though, consumers with embedded generation, solar, etc., really are changing. Passive consumers of the magic man in the wall that turns your lights on and off, you're now participating in the grid by generating your own electricity, storing your own electricity, and that's going to transform continuously over the next couple of decades. Let's look at the network just briefly and why it might be the standout as to why it hasn't actually been the one to be leading the transformation. This is just the Queensland transmission network. It's about 1,600 kilometres worth of cable. And the asset supporting that is around $10 billion. You can add a scale of about 3 times that for the distributors. So we're talking tens of billions of dollars in Queensland. So internationally, you can see why this amount of investment that up until extremely recently was an entirely viable investment might be a little bit slower to transform than some of the other parts of the electrical supply chain.
So David has just kind of given you that snapshot of this is what we have now, this is where we are now. Now, as a first step in trying to start to talk about the future, I want to introduce you to this little character here. This is a Drosophila. I don't know the entire Latin name, but basically it's Drosophila, known more commonly as the fruit fly. And let me say right off the top, I hate him, okay? I don't like much about insects. It's the buzzing, it's the biting, it's all of that. The best thing that we can do is kill them. And before you judge me, I know that they're not making all that bug spray just for me, okay? So by all means, we probably share that instinct about these types of bugs. But the thing about my strange desire to want them dead is that dying is what they do very, very well. They're freakishly good at dying. In fact, so good at dying that there are whole branches of science that depend very thoroughly on this species. And the reason that, in particular, geneticists and biologists love Drosophila, and the reason for that is that because of their very short lifespans, they're very convenient for doing genetics experiments because you can have lots and lots of generations kind of play out in the span of a few weeks. So when you just want to study kind of genetic types of phenomena, this is the perfect vehicle for delivering that. Now, we cannot, in technology management, and when we're thinking about industry architectures and thinking about how IT plays out in different industries, obviously having literal fruit flies is pretty useless. That doesn't help us at all. However, we can kind of borrow that metaphor and that analogy in the following way. Some industries happen and change, and their rate of evolution is very different from others. On one end of the spectrum, you have industries that change very quickly. Technologies are introduced every few years. It only takes a few years before you got to move on to the next generation because of obsolescence. Those are the fruit flies. Those are the fast clock speed industries, like the PC industry, like IT, okay? Now you've got much more slowly moving industries. Those are kind of on the opposite end of the spectrum. Those are the tortoises, as they were. Now, energy fits that archetype very well. Energy is very, very slow. We do a little bit of self-congratulating in the energy sector about, aren't we great for trying a new technology here and there? But overall, if you look at the rate of technological absorption within those sectors, it's pretty disappointing. And as a consequence, that is the tortoise archetype here. Now, why I say this is that, if we wanted to just study the energy sector in and of itself and look at nothing else in the marketplace, it would take us literally many decades to watch any phenomenon play out. So what we can do is use our fruit flies. That is, we can look at faster evolving industries like the PC industry and see if we can spot some useful or potentially useful industry dynamics there that might play out in a parallel or comparable way in other sectors. Now, why does the energy sector behave that way? Why does it move at that glacial pace that frustrates so many of us? There's a few compelling reasons for this. One of these is the freakishly high capital requirements involved with making changes, or with even putting this stuff up in the first place. We are talking about, as David alluded to, we're talking about 50 billion or so, billion with a B, just for all the electrical infrastructure that we need just in Queensland. If you scale it up to the rest of the world, you get a quick appreciation for the fact that we are dealing with staggering amounts of money, many, many trillions of dollars, beyond the reach of pretty much everybody in every government. So if you want to make massive changes, to throw away multiple trillions of dollars in capital investment, that's going to stink. The second part is that there's a very uncommon amount of connectivity that happens with these assets. So whereas in other sectors, they might have the benefit of being able to say, well, I can rip out that technology and put in another one, and the system's none the wiser, it doesn't really change anything. Because of the connectivity of energy systems, if you just get in there willy-nilly and start pulling stuff apart, you might create a crash in an extremely vital system that nobody wants to see go down. And thirdly, there's a political dimension to all of this too. We have been lulled into a weird place as a society where we're extremely unforgiving. When we flick that switch on, those lights better come on. And if we have anything less than 99 point something percent availability, we're going to get a little hot and bothered about that. And politicians who start to mess with that formula, they know that they do it at their own peril. Now, for us to start really getting some mileage out of that fruit fly analogy, first I want to just kind of invest 30 seconds on explaining a term that we need here. Modular architecture versus integral architecture. These are basically just kind of polar extremes on a spectrum of how coupled and integrated things are. Now, one end of that, you got products that look like stereos. Now, for a stereo system, you basically could go to a store and you could get a radio from Pioneer brand, you could buy speakers from Bose, you could get a Sony amplifier, you could take all these boxes home, and you could, I don't know why I don't actually carry boxes like this under my arms, but you get where I'm going with this. You bring it home, you plug it in, and it works. In spite of the fact that you have that long list of brands, somehow it all seems to work. That's modularity. That's a modular product architecture. Now, compare that to an integral architecture. Integral is when things are put together in a way where they're kind of designed with each other in mind. Airplane wings are a great example of that. You can't just buy airplane wings from another company somewhere and click them in like Lego blocks on an airframe somewhere else. Usually those things tend to be put together in kind of a joined up way. That is an integral product architecture. So let's look at how computers looked roughly between 1975 and 1985. Back then, computers had far more integral system architecture than what we look at now. You look at companies like IBM and Digital, they were these 800-pound gorillas that strode the earth and they had few peers. And they were capable of putting together basically all of the constituent things that we needed for a computer to do what computers do. Microprocessors, no problem. Operating systems, application software, network services, you name it, those companies had it under that one roof. They could do the whole thing and integrate it into a system that would deliver for you the functionality that you were buying. Fast forward to the 10-year period after that. 1985 to 1995. Well, I'm just kind of looking around the room here. I see, it looks like we've got people of about the right age where they probably would have witnessed this period in the PC history. And by this point, things have changed in a fairly substantial way. All of a sudden, we had a situation where microprocessors, well, you could get them from Intel, you could get them from AMD. Frankly, it didn't matter. Fill your boots, whatever you like. How about operating systems? Well, Microsoft, Apple, Unix, peripherals, printers, you basically chop and change. The system had become much, much more modular than it was even just a few short years before. And a fascinating question is, how did this come to be? How did this happen? Now, there's a lot of folklore and storytelling that goes along with this, but in a nutshell, basically, in give or take around 1977, you had the advent of the Apple II, and then IBM in particular kind of looked at the success of the Apple II and they said, wait a minute, not only are domestic customers starting to use this stuff, but businesses are starting to use this stuff too. And that got IBM's attention because, hey, that's the B in IBM, business. They said, they're stealing our lunch. We need a product that competes with the Apple II, and we need it fast. So they kind of went into panic mode because they grossly underestimated the gravitas of what was happening when they saw that PC for the first time. So they basically said, okay, even though we have the in-house capability to do semiconductors, and we can do operating systems, but we don't have products that are ready to fly right now for this new generation of PC, the personal computer, we'll call it. And so they said, well, what can we do that would get us in that market segment very, very quickly and efficiently? Well, there were these two young upstart companies by the name of Microsoft and Intel that basically stepped up and said, well, we can give you products that kind of help you get into that product niche very quickly. And IBM thought, they said, well, we've got some pixie dust-like integrative magic that will make it possible for us to procure these outside things and will still allow us to put it together in a way that the rest of the value network will have trouble duplicating. So this is a safe bet. Let's go ahead and do that. What that move did, though, is it brought about a higher degree of modularity in that value network nearly instantly with those two decisions. And by doing so, it increased the transparency of and the accessibility to the inner workings of the system in a way that all of a sudden you had dozens of other companies kind of avalanching in and saying, oh, well, now that I see how it works, I can add that bit. And now I see how that works, I can add that bit. And so we had this broad tapestry all of a sudden of all these different constituent companies saying, I can get in there and make something happen in a way that I couldn't do before this was modular. Literally, we've kind of gone from the integral airplane wing architecture to something that resembles more like, this looks more like a stereo system. So let's talk about the consequences of this change to the incumbents at the time. And this is not happy reading. IBM, between 1986 and 1992, had 100 billion with a B shaved off of their market capitalization. And that was money of the day. For those of you who are economically inclined, if you were to calculate that in today dollars, I'm sure it would be an even more ghastly figure than that. The Digital Equipment Corporation, that makes for even grimmer reading. Basically, they didn't make it. And the smoldering husk of what used to be digital was carved up into little bits and sold in 1998 to come back for pennies on the dollar. So, where did all that money go? Well, part of the smoking gun here is that we can ask ourselves what happened next to Microsoft and Intel. Microsoft in particular, I mean, they went from in the early 1980s to being only a company of maybe double-digit millions to being one of the largest market capitalization companies in the world at the height of the dot-com boom. They were one of the largest companies, and Intel wasn't too far behind. So there can be little doubt, certainly we know where it came from, and there's some hints in the market as to where the money went. So that brings us to something a little more contemporary. That brings us to where we are today. Let's talk about the disruptive potential of the digital technologies that are happening right here in the marketplace as we know it. There's been this huge range of technologies that, one at a time, that might have seemed relatively innocuous and innocent, such as, for example, big data, cloud computing, the relentless increase in the computing power of the devices that we're lugging around with us all the time. They are unbelievable in what they can do. There's a fairly lengthy list of all of these technologies that, one at a time, okay, they were kind of impressive, but the confluence, the coming together of these technologies has brought about a kind of almost magic. It's created new types of functionality that I don't think all but the very smart of us really thought. We didn't think that this was going to happen this way. And the big changes, as I see it, comes down to this one word: connectivity. All of these technologies have conspired basically to connect us in ways that we didn't see coming for the most part. How we connect between people and people socially is changing because of these technologies. How companies are able to reach out to their customers is changing because of these technologies. How companies reach out to other companies is changing. How governments can connect with their citizens is also changing.
So we've talked a little bit about some of the changes that are going on that are a little bit obvious to the consumer around PV and solar, etc., and also the change in generation mix at the generation level. But internal to the electrical supply industry, we're being very much affected by the Internet of Things. Devices, machines, sensors are now far cheaper than they were, and the points of data we can get out of a particular item of plant, like a transformer. Our previous standard of substation was to the order of about 30 times less data generated than our current standard. That's a 10-year difference in our generations of substation. That data can now permeate through our entire organisation, from the real-time operation very easily into the people who are doing much more fault or performance and capacity management, to then continuous improvement activities within the design groups, and then ultimately to the asset management function, where we're making decisions and planning the network based on the data that's now derived out of the field. So that's changing in about 10 years internally. Also, the way we're sharing or capturing that data and sharing it to other market participants is changing. The electricity market of Australia didn't exist only a number of decades ago, but it's ultimately just an information broker between the generator and the consumer. So this is now changing the business models that are possible. The other thing that's occurring is the digitalization of a lot of these grid technologies to create what we're calling now a smart grid. What used to be point-to-point solutions to monitor and control the power network are now much more distributed and intelligent. So we're getting to ideas like self-healing grids, the ability to have contingencies where we don't have to build at the scale and reliability in raw metal that we used to do to provide reliability, because we can have computers make decisions in far faster timeframes than humans were available to do in the past. The other change that's occurring now as well is that prosumer activity we're talking about, where consumers are participating in the market. So there are a number of these technologies that are starting to conspire to change how fundamentally electricity is used and consumed within our industry.
So here's where we kind of go back to the fruit flies and ask ourselves, what can we learn from the PC, the IBM story? Is there any industry dynamics there that might shed a useful amount of light on what's happening with the electricity sector? David mentioned the Internet of Things. We have a situation emerging where we have systems being digitally rigged up so that they can kind of chirp information at us and tell you the state of what is happening with them in real time. This digital information is infinitely replicable for near zero economic cost. And a consequence of that is that we are able to share digital information about the state of any point in the value network. We can share it with any company that is in that value network and any company that might aspire to be in that value network. We now have this ability where we can basically start to mix and match and cut and subdivide, draw lines on organizational charts in places where they were not before. And that is because of this increased transparency of and accessibility to the inner workings of a system. It's not exactly the same mechanism that delivered that change as what we saw with the IBM story, but the functionality in terms of what it's doing to the value network, it does resemble that. And what makes me suspect that that's a safe leap in logic? Well, how about this? It's because we're seeing it in lots of industries that are contemporary in where the changes are happening. Let's talk for a minute about, let's go across the rogues gallery here. Uber, the largest vehicular transportation organization in the world today, doesn't own a single car. Airbnb, The largest hospitality organization in the world today doesn't own a single bed. Amazon.com, the largest retail organization on the planet today, doesn't have a single store that you can visit. What's happening because of these digital technologies is it's bringing about a situation where we are able to modularize the value network. We can decouple and unbundle the physical network from the supporting functions that allow us to get to that kind of value and functionality.
These fragmentations and modularity are occurring, as we've said, very much in the generation and consumer action. What might be viable for network providers in the future is to actually realize that a lot of that stack of things that they do now, maintenance, operation, planning, building and designing networks, might not be functional under a single organizational banner anymore. That monolithic utility of the current age may not be the viable business model of the future. So the challenge for those sort of organizations at the moment is to really understand, are you an excellent asset management organization? Are you an excellent fleet field force deployment organization? Maybe these are the parts that you might want to defend, because ultimately we saw IBM wasn't able to try and keep hold of all of those stacks, functions that it was doing in the past. Moving beyond that, retailers are now working between customers and the market itself, but maybe the potential for C2C interactions where conglomerates of consumers and microgrids are actually able to trade electricity between themselves rather than actually relying on monolithic organizations to intermediate those transactions. And this is where the deja vu comes in. Those microgrids really aren't dissimilar to how the dawn of electricity really occurred, where you had small municipalities, but many of, across a nation, for example, generating and consuming electricity. So we're moving back to a decentralized model, but because retaining the reliability that we've been able to provide via the scaled, reliable, centralized network we've had to date. And this is what we're seeing. We really are seeing history starting to repeat itself with a disaggregation, etc. So if you're a network provider now, it may be that you don't control an area of jurisdiction from a generator through to consumers as a large linear network that's highly connected across an entire nation like Australia. It may be much more like a road network where you still have streets and places where we all drive every day, but there are high transfer points needed for bulk supply, like the Gateway Bridge or toll tunnels, etc. That might be the future of a transmission industry, for example. Distributors might actually do more of the consumer-to-consumer transaction rather than generator-to-consumer transaction. So there's still a business model for these organizations, but it's fundamentally different to how it's currently configured.
So an interesting part of the IBM story is the fact that it did not die, while some of the other people who were splashing around in that part of the market, they did die. So it kind of, an obvious question that arises out of that is, why did they survive? What happened there? And there might be some helpful, some helpful precedent there that might be really handy for us as we think about the future moves of the electricity sector. Here's what IBM had to do to survive. They had to dump the personal computer division, basically the industry that they created. And this was a real coup because, you know, who could be more into PCs than the company that breathed life into this at the very beginning of the whole thing, right? So you had the Apple II, but the actual personal computer platform, that was IBM. So for them to cut bait and to hand that over to Lenovo from China in 2005, that's a pretty big deal. They must have been pretty scared to make a move like that. In tandem to that, they also said, well, it's not enough just that we provide whiz-bang gizmos anymore. We're not just the creators of high-end technology. What our new customers need from us now is they need us to provide joined-up solutions where we are giving full technology solutions that offer not just the widgets and the gadgets, but also the understanding and the services and the change management that kind of go with that into a wrapped-up bundle that helps to deliver to our customers what they need in a joined-up way. So they bought, to that end, they bought one of the main 5 consulting companies at the time. Now, the big point, the big punchline that I think we need to take out of this, though, is that when faced with that kind of earthquake, tectonic kind of change, that quick modularization delivered in their industry, this required not trivial changes, not just kind of painting around the periphery of the thing. This required a fundamental transforming of the DNA of that century-long organization. This took a tremendous amount of effort and resources and huge cut that part of the organization and add that one. It was not a small thing. That's what that takes. And here's why this matters today. It matters because we, at the moment, if you kind of look at the landscape of how electricity happens these days, as David said in those early slides, we have in that network huge monolithic organizations that may well be going through a tectonic type change, in much the way that IBM did only a few decades ago. This will require, if they're going to survive, we submit, this will require massive change, not fiddling on the periphery, massive fundamental change. So let's talk about, in this new IT savvy marketplace that we have to operate in, what does that new normal look like? Well, we can kind of, again, looking to the fruit flies of the marketplace for inspiration, here's what we see happening. Companies that get it and that are embracing the digital and IT revolution, here's what they do well that a lot of capital-intensive industries have failed to do so far. I'm not saying that they won't ever get it, but this is kind of one of the big noticeable differences. If you look at a lot of those traditional capital-intensive industries, they talk about their assets as the things you can touch that have been at the core of their revenue-generating ability for decades. And data is just digital information that basically tells them about the state of the stuff that they really consider to be the assets. What the leading organizations are doing that is different, and that is a 90-degree turn versus what the capital-intensive industries are talking about, is that they realize that data isn't just about an asset, data is an asset. And that is a quantum leap in thinking for an organization to make. Let me just use a for instance here. Walmart. Walmart collects every hour multiple petabytes of data about retail transactions. A petabyte is 1,000,000 gigabytes. So imagine that little 4 gigabyte pen drive that you have in your pocket right now. Well, we're talking about many, many, many more than you could drag around. Every hour they collect that. Why do they do that? They do that because it gives them a vantage point from which they can understand the entire ecosystem of the part of the market that they occupy. It gives them strategic advantage because they understand, they can see the broad trends unfolding and happening better than anybody else in the ecosystem. Why? Because they control the data. They can integrate the data, they can analyze the data. They have a better position for seeing all of that unfolding than anybody else in the rest of that sector. David, when we were chatting about this earlier, he pointed out, he said, there are some organizations in the electricity sector that are sitting on a potential gold mine. They do have that natural data streaming into me advantage already happening, and they may be at the moment failing to realize the increasingly strategic, how strategically advantageous that position could be. I was talking earlier about this uncomfortable reality where some industries were slow-moving. I even invoked the term glacial. In other industries are a little quicker to kind of absorb new technologies and get on with using them. There's an idea here, one of our parting shots. There's an idea from Salim Ismail. He's a fellow Canadian, who he was in charge in Silicon Valley of heading up Yahoo's incubator. And he came up with this total corker of a quote that is very relevant here. Once you turn something digital, it hops onto that Moore's law pace of change and accelerates. Let me paraphrase what he's saying there. Once we start to infuse into an industry all this IT stuff that we've been talking about here, mysteriously, there seems to be this instant uptick in the rate of change within that industry. We've seen it happen when was the last time somebody really shook up the taxi industry? At a conceptual level, that was pretty much static for the better part of at least half a century, probably much longer than that. And all of a sudden, boom, upside down. Why? IT types of technologies. And this is true whether we're talking about taxis or cosmetics or retail buying of clothing. There seems to be no end to the examples where this seems to hold true. So what I'm saying to you is, even though I was kind of deriding the energy sector for being a bit Luddite and a bit slow to absorb new technology, here's what's coming. That lazy pace of change that the energy sector has been treated to, where we thought we could kind of do it in baby steps, I think that that is eroding fast. And that pace of change is going to look pretty different in a few years than it does right now. And that probably, we also want to underline that we're not asking these questions in a purely rhetorical way. The challenges, the issues that we've identified here, these are exactly the kinds of research agenda items and research questions that we are working on with the PwC Chair in Digital Economy. We're working at a very aggressive pace on trying to wrestle these questions to the ground. And if there's any like-minded spirits in the crowd here that also are interested in pursuing these kinds of things, you've got birds of a feather here. We'd very much like you to reach out and make contact. Thank you very much.